Hi, I'm Maggie. Thank you for stopping by Crafts the Charm today. You are most welcome here. A couple of years ago, I started seeing pillows that looked like cable knit sweaters, sort of like this one. And so I decided to learn to knit so that I could make my own. So after a lot of practice, this was my first knitting project. Now, anytime that you're knitting something that's basically a rectangle, it's a pretty basic project. But a pillow like this, it requires 2 stitches, knitting and purling. And if you're an experienced knitter, you know a lot more about that than I do. But it's also helpful to have a cabling needle, which helps you make these cables. So sometime on this channel, we will make a pillow like this. But I thought it would be really fun to see what we could do with just 1 stitch, the knit stitch, and some yarn from Dollar Tree. So let's see what we can make with 1 stitch and some Dollar Tree yarn. Let's go have some fun.
One way that you can change decor for the seasons is to change the covers on your pillows. So I like to have a few pillow forms and then replace the covers in different seasons. This is a white faux fur pillow cover that I really like in the winter. And I measured this to determine how big I want to make my knit pillow cover. And this turned out to be about 17.5 by 18 inches. The pillow form itself says that the finished size is 18 inches by 18 inches. So that's the target size for my knit pillow cover. This is the yarn that I'm going to be using, and this is from the Dollar Tree. It's just yarn in gray tweed. And you want to pull the yarn out of the end. This one had already come out. And what we're going to do first is knit a swatch on the needles that I'll be using for this project. These are 6mm needles. So to begin knitting, what we need to do is put the yarn on the needle. So first you're going to make a loop and put the needle through that loop. Now there are lots of methods of casting on. This actually isn't the method that I usually use, and I think different methods will give you a different edge. The edge of our fabric isn't important because it won't be seen. So what I'm choosing here is a really simple cast on method because this is a beginner project. So you can see I'm basically just making twisted loops and putting them on the needle. And I'm going to cast on 16 stitches. That includes that initial loop. And now I'm going to begin knitting. And knitting is the process of moving the yarn from one needle to the other needle. And we are only going to be using the knit stitch in this project. Now, I used 2 different methods for creating a knit stitch, and I'm going to show you both here. So with the knit stitch, the yarn is behind the needle. I'm holding it in my left hand, but you might also hold it in your right hand. We'll see that in a minute. You put the needle that you're moving the yarn to into the stitch that's on the needle behind it, and then scoop up that yarn. Now here I've split the yarn, which you don't want to do. So I'm showing how I sort of split that. I split it again there. And so if you find yourself doing that, just pull that stitch back and do it over so that you're not splitting the yarn, because that can make it look like you have more stitches on your needle, and then suddenly you find you've got 17 stitches instead of 16. Now this is the other method. This is the English method, and in this one you hold the yarn in your right hand and you throw it over the needle. It's the same stitch. They're both a knit stitch. So in both of them you slide into that stitch that's on the needle and you put the needle behind. But in this case you throw the yarn over, whereas with the other method, which is called the continental method, you scoop up the yarn. So there's a lot more hand motion with the right hand, or the dominant hand, with the English method. Now you repeat. So you just keep moving yarn from one needle to the other needle. The continental method is a little bit faster, so that's the method that I've been using recently. I started with the English method. What I recommend is, if you're not an experienced knitter, if you can do these stitches, so either one of these methods of doing the knit stitch from watching my video, that's great. I'm glad I was able to show you how to do that. If not, I recommend just look for other videos on YouTube. There are so many amazing experienced knitters on YouTube. And in my experience, you just need to find the video that shows how to do the technique that makes the most sense to you. Sometimes I'll watch 4, 5, 6 videos before I find the one where it finally clicks for me what I'm supposed to be doing. So what I'm doing is knitting a swatch. So I'm going to keep knitting until I have a square of fabric. Now I almost have a square, and here I'm just showing why I like to use this style of needle, which is called a circular needle, because you can slide your knitting off the needle onto that middle part and it doesn't accidentally fall off. So I have about 4.5 inches from my 16 cast on stitches, but I've only knit about 4 inches. It's not really important here that I make a square, but I was making a square. So I just continue to knit a little bit more until I have about a 4.5 by 4.5 inch square. The reason that we make a swatch is so we know the size of our knitting, because everybody knits a little bit differently. I think I'm probably a very loose knitter. I'm not sure. You might be a tighter knitter. So we need to know how many stitches to cast on to get the 18-inch pillow cover. Now, once you've completed your square, you want to bind off. And this means we're going to remove our finished fabric from the needle. So to bind off, you're going to knit 2 stitches, and then you take the further stitch and pull it over the stitch nearer the tip of the needle. And then you just repeat. And for some reason I decided I wanted to do this English style. I think the yarn tends to get in my way when I do this continental. So this actually is quite a bit easier English for me. So just continue, knit a stitch, pull the old stitch over until you reach the end. Then you'll have 1 stitch left. And when you have this 1 stitch left, what you would do is you would cut the yarn and you would pull it through that little loop that you have, and then your swatch is complete. Now I'm going to unravel this swatch because I want to reuse the yarn. My purpose of knitting the swatch was to find out how many stitches I have to cast on in order to create my 18-inch pillow form. So I've got 4.5 inches and I had cast on 16 stitches. What I decided is I want to make sure I have plenty of fabric for this pillow form because we are going to be sewing a seam across the middle and cutting it. So I decided that what I really want to knit is a 19-inch square of fabric, or 2 of them actually, in 2 different colors. Now the number of rows that I've knit isn't quite as important in this case because we'll just knit until we have our 19 inches. So here I'm just unraveling that swatch and putting it back on the skein, and I will use that when I knit my pillow form. So the calculations, we have a ratio of number of stitches cast on to the width of the finished product. And so I want to maintain that ratio because my knitting will stay the same. That's my knitting ratio, I guess. So if I want to get a 19-inch finished piece of fabric, then I can multiply that by 16 and divide by the 4.5 inches. And I come up with 67.5 inches stitches repeating, which is approximately 68 stitches. So that's how many I'm going to cast on. So I'm going to continue with the Just Yarn tweed in the gray tweed. For the black color, I ended up not using the charcoal that I'm showing here, but I ended up using charcoal tweed. Now that I'm looking at them, I think that original charcoal might have looked nicer. One thing I've noticed, this is Dollar Tree yarn, is that the skeins are 98 yards now. This other one, this original charcoal color, was a lot more yarn. So I'm not sure if this yarn is really a good value. Now we're going to cast on 68 stitches, which can be a pain to count. These are stitch markers, and what I'm going to do is cast on 10 stitches and then put a stitch marker on my needle. And that way I only have to count 10 at a time, and I can be pretty confident that each stitch marker represents 10 stitches, and I don't have to count all of the stitches to make sure I have the correct number. So I'm using the same cast on method, which is making that little twisted loop and pulling it over the needle. And once I have my 10 stitches, just slide a stitch marker on. That won't get in the way. I always have to double check. And then continue casting on, and every 10 stitches, just put on a new stitch marker. Until we finally have our 68, and you don't need to keep those on there, but you can if you want to. You just transfer them to the other needle as you knit, and that ensures that you haven't dropped or added any stitches. When I was first learning, I did a lot of dropping and adding stitches. I didn't know how. I think I know how that happens now a little bit more. But it's not really that big a deal unless you end up with a big hole in your fabric, and there are ways to repair things like that. So that's another thing you could look up if you happen to make that sort of mistake. So I had decided with this cast on method, I definitely found it easier to knit in the English style for that first row. So that's why I'm knitting English style here, but we're just going to continue knitting, transferring the yarn from one needle to the other until we have our 19 inches of fabric. Now at some point in your knitting, you're going to run out of yarn on your skein, and this is how far I got. Let's see, it looks like about maybe between 6 and 7 inches, and I'm almost out. So I'm going to start a new skein, and I'm just going to demonstrate to you how I do that. So I felt like I could knit a little bit more. I don't like to waste. We'll get there. There we go. Okay, so I did knit a few more stitches, and we're going to end up with some ends hanging off the finished work, and don't worry, at the end I'll show you how to weave those in. So the way I like to do this is I knit with 2 strands when I'm starting the new skein, and I'm going to do that for I think 3 stitches here, and then I drop the old yarn and just continue with the new one. Now notice now that we've got these 3 double stitches here, and we want to make sure that when we return we knit those as one. So you might want to put a stitch marker on here just so you're aware when it's coming up, and you're careful to knit those as 1 stitch each instead of as 2 stitches. So I continued knitting that, and I've now turned around and knit the other direction, and we're coming up on those 3 double stitches. So I just wanted to illustrate knitting those as one. So we will knit up to those. And now just pull both of those stitches onto your needle as if they were one piece of yarn. And I had to tug on that little end there a little bit to make it tight. And do that for all 3. And now we don't have to worry about them anymore. They're back to single stitches. So we're going to keep going, and I'm going to knit 2 19 by 19 inch squares, one in this gray color and the other in the charcoal. Once you're done, you're going to bind off, so I'm just showing you the binding off from the swatch again. Knit 2 stitches, pull the back one over the front one, and continue to the end. I had footage of binding off the original piece of fabric and I lost it, so I thought, same process, I would just insert this back in. But of course, with my 19-inch square, I did cut my yarn and pull it through loop. Now once I have my 2 squares, I'm going to do something called blocking. And I don't know how strictly important this is for a pillow cover, but if you plan to wash the pillow cover at any time, you probably want to block it at this stage. So I soaked those in lukewarm water for about 20 minutes. And I noticed that a little bit of dye did come off the yarn, so I would recommend doing them separately. I don't think it made a difference here. but especially if your colors are brighter, or if you have a red, or if they're very different colors, I would not do them together. Of course, then you probably shouldn't wash them either, should you? So just gently wring out all the water from each piece, and then you're going to roll it up in a towel and again squeeze it to get the water out. And then you just want to leave it to dry. I actually got a little impatient. Mine seemed to be taking a very long time to dry, and so I did actually throw them in the dryer, which was fine. I've made sweaters out of this yarn, and I wash and dry them all the time. And they're actually really soft sweaters. I kind of like this yarn from the Dollar Tree. I won't say I've made really nice sweaters. I am a beginner. But it's really satisfying to be able to make your own clothes. And they're very warm. Alright, so we're going to let those dry, or throw them in the dryer if you're impatient like I am. Now, here's the plan. I had made these 2 little swatches previously. And the plan is I want some fabric that is diagonally divided. So I thought we'll lay them right sides together and then pin them on the diagonal. This is the plan. And then stitch on either side of that diagonal. So we end up with 2 pieces. So we get 2 pillow covers, or you could sew them to each other and get 1 pillow cover which has this fabric on both sides. So we pin them diagonally. And it took me quite a long time to knit 2 19 by 19 inch squares in garter stitch, which is what this is called when you knit going both directions. So I was definitely going to try this on a swatch before I tried it on my 19 by 19 inch squares. The pins I felt did not work very well, so what I decided was to take a contrasting color yarn, so I'm using this bright yellow yarn, and just do a running stitch, a sort of a basting stitch down the middle, and sew on either side of that. I'm using a plastic yarn needle here, which I find works very well with knitting projects. Okay, that's not completely straight, but I'm figuring you can make a straight line, and I'm figuring I can sew it straight on the sewing machine, even though that line isn't very straight. So we're going to stitch that up, and I'll say it was quite thick, and it wasn't very easy to run this through the sewing machine, but it was definitely possible. You know, maybe I'm using the wrong kind of foot here for this. I haven't actually sewn knitting before, but I know it is possible. So I cut it, and it came out great. So onto the real pillow cover. Now you'll notice that there are these ends from where we had to add a new skein of yarn. So I'm just going to show you how to weave those ends in, but using the swatch with a contrasting color yarn. And I will put a link to a really good video on weaving in ends below. Okay, so to weave in the end, again, do this on the wrong side. And you're always going to be going over those loops. So go up and then over a little loop and then down diagonally. Now go under a little loop and up diagonally. So you end up through the place you just came down. Then over the little loop and down diagonally. So you end up going through the one you came out of before, then around that little loop and up diagonally. I don't know, I sort of remember it is over the rainbow, under the rainbow. But again, I will link a video of an expert knitter who explains it very well. If this doesn't make sense. And what she says is, as long as you get them woven in, it's probably okay, but this is the correct technique. So where you weave in ends will be on the wrong side of the fabric, because we don't want to see that, and we'll put the right sides together. Find the diagonal. And we're going to do that basting stitch. The advantage to this over the pins too is that it's flat. Now we stitch that on the sewing machine just as we did for the swatch. So we're going to go down each side of the stitching that we put down the middle. So each side of that contrasting stitching. There were places where I did accidentally stitch over that yellow yarn. It wasn't a big deal. You couldn't see it in the finished product. And now we're at the terrifying cutting stage, but maybe we're not quite as frightened as we would be if we hadn't done the swatch. So that worked. Yes, you can see I had some trouble getting all of the yellow yarn out. If it had made a difference in the end, I would have worked at getting it out after I cut down that center seam, but it wasn't visible at all, the little bits that were left. You could just be more careful than me and not sew them to begin with. Okay, so just looking, you can see you can't see them. It looks good. Take a deep breath and definitely make sure you're cutting in between the stitches. Now I'm just going to steam iron it. So I'm just wetting down that dishcloth that I use as an ironing cloth. And we're just going to iron over it just to flatten it out a little bit along that seam. Now ideally I think I would want a black or gray upholstery fabric, something a little bit heavy for the back of these pillows, but I just went through what I had, and I had this gray fabric, I have no idea where it came from, and then this black sort of velvety fabric, and I ended up deciding on the gray fabric. Having chosen the fabric for the back, I just decided to make a very simple pillowcase. So I cut this into two pieces that will then overlap on the back of the pillow, so leaving a very large opening to put the pillow form into. You can, of course, make whatever kind of pillow you want. You could just use one solid piece and sew your pillow form into it, or you could do something a little fancier like buttons or a zipper. So I just sewed a seam on each of the pieces for the back of the pillowcase. That's one of them sewn, and then I'm just going to run the other seam along the sewing machine. Now I'm going to make 2 pillow covers. You could, of course, sew the 2 pieces of knit fabric together and make one pillow cover that's knit on both sides. So originally I did try to sew this to the knit fabric on my sewing machine, and that did not work. So I instead sewed it together so that at least along the edge it was one solid piece, and you can see I've pinned it together where it will open eventually, and I then hand sewed around the edge of the pillowcase. So it was much easier to hand sew this and come up with a nice straight edge than it was for me to sew it on the sewing machine. You might have better luck on the sewing machine. I hope you do. But the advantage to this is I could do a basting stitch or a running stitch around the edge and see if the size was good, and it would be very easy to pull out or sew on the inside of that if the size is either too small or too large. So I turned the pillowcase and poked out the corners. And then it was time to insert the pillow form and see how it fits. And it fit fine. You might want a little more overlap in the back. That amount of overlap was fine with me. And there's the finished pillow.
I'd love to know what you thought of our pillow project. It took me a long time to knit the 2 panels, but I like to have something to do while I'm watching TV, so I just did it over about a week, and I thought it was fun and relaxing. I'll admit I was really scared when it came time to cut the fabric because I had spent so much time knitting it. If you liked this project, please consider giving the video a thumbs up. And if you enjoy this sort of content, please consider subscribing to Crafts the Charm. There will be more beginner knitting projects, as well as more advanced knitting projects in which I'll show you the stitches. Thank you for spending time with me today. Take care.